The grand chamber of the Galactic Council stood silent as Ambassador Marcus Webb walked to the center platform. His footsteps echoed against the crystalline walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of interstellar cooperation. Above him, representatives from 47 different species watched from their elevated seats, their faces unreadable in the dim lighting that suited so many different kinds of eyes. Marcus had known this day might come. The whispers had started months ago in the corridors. The private meetings his staff was no longer invited to attend, the sudden coolness from delegates who had once been friendly. Humanity had always been different, always pushing boundaries that others preferred to leave untouched. For 300 years that difference had been tolerated, sometimes even celebrated. But tolerance, Marcus had learned, was not the same as acceptance. The charges were read by Council Speaker Venth, a towering being whose species had held power in the galaxy for over 10,000 years. The words were carefully chosen, legally sound yet utterly hollow. Humanity was disruptive. Humanity violated the spirit of established protocols. Humanity introduced unnecessary changes to systems that had functioned adequately for millennia. The message was clear even if the language tried to hide it. Humans tried too hard, cared too much, and made everyone else uncomfortable by comparison. No evidence was presented because none was needed. The vote had been decided before the session began. 41 species voted for exile, 4 abstained. Only 2 voted against the measure, both of them minor species whose colonies had benefited directly from human engineering projects. Their votes counted for little in a system that weighted power by age and territorial holdings. Marcus stood silent as the verdict was delivered. He could have argued, could have pointed out the medical advances humanity had shared freely, the infrastructure projects completed at cost, the rescue missions launched without hesitation whenever disaster struck any world in Council space. But he recognized the futility. This was not about facts or justice. This was about fear. Fear of being left behind by a younger, hungrier species that never seemed satisfied with the status quo. The sentence was elegant in its simplicity. All humans were to withdraw from Council space within 1 standard year. All colonies, stations, and outposts were to be evacuated. All joint ventures dissolved. All military personnel recalled. Humanity would be permitted to settle beyond the outer rim, in the unexplored territories that had been deemed too hostile or unprofitable for other species to bother with. The galaxy was effectively telling humanity to disappear quietly and never come back. Captain Lisa Grant received the orders 3 days later aboard the SS Horizon, currently in orbit around Talos Prime, where human engineers were completing a geothermal power network that would provide clean energy for the next 500 years. She read the message twice, then called her senior staff to the briefing room. The faces around the table showed anger, confusion, and hurt. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes wanted to know if they could appeal. Chief Engineer Sandra Cole asked what would happen to the projects they had promised to finish. Medical Officer Frank Porter wondered about his patients in the colony hospital who were still recovering from the viral outbreak his team had finally contained last month. Lisa had no answers that would satisfy them. Orders were orders, and despite the injustice, humanity had decided to comply. The alternative was war, and no one wanted that. The human leadership had made a choice. They would leave with dignity, finish what could be finished in the time allowed, and transfer everything else to local control. They would not give the Council any excuse to paint them as dangerous or unreasonable. The evacuation began within a week. On industrial worlds, human factory managers trained their replacements in systems they had optimized over decades. In hospitals, human doctors transferred patient files and treatment protocols to alien colleagues. On frontier colonies, human families packed belongings accumulated over generations. Taking one last look at homes they had built with their own hands, Danny Fisher stood in the maintenance bay of Station Theta 9, walking a young Kellian technician through the water reclamation system for the 4th time. The alien was smart and willing to learn, but Danny could see the gaps. The system was simple if you understood the underlying principles, but it required intuition to know when something was starting to go wrong before alarm sounded. He had spent 15 years developing that intuition. His replacement had 3 weeks. On Ven 5, production supervisor Amy Price conducted final walkthroughs of the orbital factories she had helped design. The assembly lines hummed with efficiency, producing components for starships at rates the Venians had never achieved before humans arrived. Amy had reorganized the entire workflow, eliminating bottlenecks and reducing waste by 40%. The improvements seemed obvious to her now, but they had taken years of observation and experimentation. She left detailed documentation, knowing even as she wrote it that documents could not capture everything. Research stations were perhaps the hardest to abandon. Dr. Chris Bennett sealed his laboratory on Science Station, Kepler with a heavy heart. He and his team had been close to a breakthrough in quantum field manipulation that could revolutionize faster-than-light travel. The data was all there, carefully organized and annotated, ready for whoever came next. But science was not just data. It was intuition, inspiration, the willingness to pursue wild ideas that probably would not work but just might. He worried that his successors would play it safe, follow the documented procedures, and never make the leap required for true discovery. 6 months after the council vote, the last human transport departed from council space. Governor Paul Martinez stood on the bridge of the colony ship New Dawn, watching the border marker drift past on the view screen. Behind them lay everything humanity had built in 3 centuries of galactic citizenship. Ahead lay the unknown, the supposedly uninhabitable regions that other species had surveyed and dismissed as worthless. The fleet consisted of 300 vessels carrying 12 million people, everything they could salvage from their former lives. Ships designed for exploration, for cargo, for research, even a few military vessels that had been allowed to leave provided they never returned. It was not a grand armada but a refugee convoy, though no one used that word officially. Marcus Webb sat in his cabin aboard the flagship, writing his final report. He described the proceedings, the vote, the terms of exile, but he also wrote something else, a prediction that he would not live to see proven. He wrote that the council had made a terrible mistake, not because humanity would seek revenge, but because they would succeed without them. Humans did not need the council's approval to thrive. They never had. What the council needed, though it did not yet realize it, was humanity's drive to never accept good enough. The fleet crossed into uncharted space, and the council breathed easier, believing the disruption had ended. In the vast silence of the galaxy, that belief would soon be tested. 3 years had passed since the last human ship crossed beyond the outer rim, and the Galactic Council had settled back into comfortable routines. Committee meetings ran on schedule, trade agreements were renewed with minor modifications, and the bureaucratic machinery that governed 47 species hummed along as it had for thousands of years. The disruption was over, or so everyone believed. Council Administrator Zixthor of the Kellian hierarchy sat in his office on Station Theta 9, reviewing maintenance reports with growing frustration. The water reclamation system had failed again, the 3rd time this month. The failure was not catastrophic. Backup systems had engaged properly, but the pattern worried him. Before the humans left, such failures had been rare. Danny Fisher had maintained these systems across 17 stations, somehow always knowing when something needed attention before it actually broke. The Kellian technician who had replaced Fisher was competent and followed all protocols correctly. Diagnostics were run on schedule, parts were replaced according to manufacturer recommendations, and logs were meticulously maintained. Yet the breakdowns kept happening. Zixthor had reviewed the documentation Fisher left behind, hundreds of pages detailing every aspect of the system. But reading about intuition was not the same as having it. Similar reports arrived from other stations. Life support systems required more frequent repairs. Power distribution networks experienced unexpected fluctuations. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that suggested sabotage, just a slow degradation of reliability that had not existed when humans were around. Zixthor filed his reports with the Council Oversight Committee, recommending increased maintenance budgets. The committee noted his concerns and scheduled a study group to examine the issue, with findings expected in 18 months. On the industrial world of Ven 5, production numbers told a troubling story. The orbital factories that had set efficiency records under human management were now operating at barely 60% of previous output. Factory Director Krell reviewed the numbers repeatedly, searching for an explanation. The machinery was the same, maintained according to the same schedules. The workforce was actually larger than before, filled with Venian workers who had previously assisted human supervisors. Raw materials were abundant and of good quality, yet somehow everything took longer. Assembly lines that once flowed smoothly now experienced frequent minor stoppages. Quality control rejected more components for small defects that required rework. Shift changes became chaotic as workers struggled with assignments that used to be handled seamlessly. Krell implemented new procedures, hired consultants, and studied the documentation Amy Price had left behind. Nothing helped. What Krell could not see, could not quantify in reports, was the absence of constant small improvements. Humans had always tinkered, always experimented with slight variations in technique, always looked for ways to shave a few seconds off production time or reduce waste by a fraction of a percent. These changes had seemed insignificant individually, barely worth noting in daily logs. Cumulatively, over years, they had transformed mediocre factories into exceptional ones. Without that constant drive to optimize, the factories had simply reverted to being mediocre again. In the research sectors, the impact was more subtle but perhaps more profound. Dr. Kellen Vross sat alone in Laboratory 7 on Science Station Kepler, surrounded by equipment that mocked him with its silence. The quantum field research project had stalled completely. All the data Chris Bennett had left was available, every experiment documented, every theory explained in careful detail. Vross understood the science intellectually, could follow the mathematics, and replicate the experimental procedures. What he could not replicate was Bennett's willingness to try ideas that seemed crazy. The human researcher had filled his private notes with wild speculations, impossible scenarios explored just to see what might happen. Most led nowhere, dead ends that wasted time and resources. But occasionally, one of those impossible ideas worked, opening new avenues of investigation that careful, methodical research would never have found. Vross was a good scientist, trained in the best institutions, respected by his peers. But he was not a reckless scientist, and this field apparently required a touch of recklessness. Medical facilities across Council Space faced a different kind of problem. Dr. Senna of the Thalaxian Medical Consortium stared at the supply reports with disbelief. Critical shortages of common medications were appearing across 12 systems simultaneously. The pharmaceutical synthesis plants were running properly, producing the same compounds they always had. Yet yields were down almost 40% and no one could explain why. Investigation revealed a pattern. Human chemists working in synthesis plants throughout Council Space had developed dozens of small process improvements over the years. A slight adjustment in temperature here, a modification to catalyst ratios there, an alternative purification technique that worked better with certain raw material batches. These improvements had been shared freely in informal discussions, demonstrated to colleagues, implemented without formal documentation because they seemed like common sense rather than innovations. Now those human chemists were gone, and with them went the accumulated wisdom of decades. The alien chemists who remained followed the official procedures correctly, but the official procedures had not been updated to include the improvements. No one had realized how much the humans had been carrying the system until they were no longer there to carry it. Trade routes began showing strain as well. Captain Vex of the merchant vessel Prosperity found herself waiting 3 weeks for a cargo escort through the Kessler Belt, a treacherous asteroid field that required skilled navigation. Human pilots had always taken these routes, their faster reflexes and higher risk tolerance making them ideal for dangerous but profitable runs. The pay had been excellent, and humans seemed to enjoy the challenge in a way that baffled other species. Now those routes were understaffed, and ships waited in queue or took longer alternative paths that added weeks to delivery schedules. Goods that once flowed freely throughout Council Space began piling up in warehouses. Shipping costs increased to reflect the reduced efficiency. Colonies on the frontier, dependent on regular supply runs, started rationing non-essential items. The galactic economy did not crash, but it slowed, creaking under inefficiencies that had not existed 3 years earlier. Commander Tresh reviewed tactical reports from the Council Defense Fleet with mounting concern. Pirate activity had increased in the outer systems, emboldened by slower response times from defense forces. The fleet had not shrunk in size. Ships and personnel numbers were actually higher than before. But something had changed in how they operated. Human crews had always been the first responders, their ships somehow ready to launch faster than others, their captains willing to take risks that kept pirates off balance. Now the fleet felt sluggish, reactive instead of proactive. Pirates struck and escaped before defense ships arrived. Convoy raids that would have been prevented became successful. Civilian casualties mounted slowly but steadily. Tresh recommended tactical reforms and training programs to improve response times. His superiors approved the recommendations and formed a committee to study implementation. The committee would deliver its findings in a year, maybe two. Meanwhile, the pirates grew bolder. Colony worlds at the edge of Council space faced perhaps the most immediate problems. Governor Nethys of Frontier Colony Outpost 77 watched workers struggle to repair a water main break that had flooded an entire residential sector. The repair should have been simple, but the crew had been working for 2 days with little progress. Karen Morris and Jake Sullivan had designed this entire settlement's infrastructure, adapting Earth engineering principles to the harsh local conditions. Their plans were detailed and their construction solid, which was why the colony had thrived. But when something went wrong, when adaptation and improvisation were needed, the current crew found themselves lost. They could follow blueprints, but they could not think like the humans who had drawn them. They did not have the instinct for making things work against the odds. Reports flowed into Council headquarters from across governed space. None described catastrophic failures. Nothing that suggested immediate crisis. Just a slow degradation, a gradual decrease in the efficiency and reliability that everyone had taken for granted. The Council reviewed these reports in committee, discussed them in subcommittees, and commissioned studies to investigate root causes. The conclusion was always the same. They would adapt. Systems would be updated, personnel retrained, new procedures implemented. It was simply a matter of time and proper resource allocation. The humans had left a gap, certainly, but it was a gap that could be filled by properly motivated workers from the remaining species. 3 years after exile, the Council remained confident that they had made the right decision. The disruption was over and normalcy would soon return. They failed to recognize that what they called disruption had actually been progress, and what they called normalcy was simply stagnation wearing a comfortable mask. 7 years had passed since humanity's exile, and what had begun as minor inconveniences had grown into systemic failures that threatened the stability of the entire Galactic Council. The reports that flooded into the Central Administration painted a picture of a civilization slowly grinding to a halt, though few wanted to acknowledge what the pattern revealed. The medical crisis hit first and hardest. Dr. Senna stood before the Emergency Health Committee, presenting data that should have been impossible. Hospitals across 12 systems were rationing basic medications. Vaccines for common childhood diseases were in short supply. Surgical facilities were canceling non-emergency procedures due to lack of anesthetics. The pharmaceutical production network, which had functioned reliably for over 1,000 years, was collapsing. The committee members listened with growing alarm as Senna explained what investigations had uncovered. Production yields at synthesis plants had dropped to 40% of pre-exile levels. The plants were running properly according to all technical specifications. Equipment was maintained, raw materials were adequate, and workers followed established protocols precisely. Yet the output continued to fall. The problem, Senna explained, was that established protocols no longer reflected actual best practices. Over decades, human chemists had developed hundreds of small improvements to synthesis processes. A temperature adjustment that increased yield by 2%. A timing modification that reduced contamination. A catalyst preparation technique that worked better with certain material batches. These improvements had been shared informally between facilities, demonstrated in person, passed along through mentorship and casual conversation. No one had thought to document them formally because they seemed obvious, just common sense to anyone who understood the work. But common sense was not universal, and what seemed obvious to human chemists was not obvious to others. The official protocols remained unchanged, reflecting processes that were technically correct but practically obsolete. Following them produced medications that met minimum standards but at drastically reduced efficiency. The committee authorized emergency funding to update all protocols and retrain workers, but even as they issued the order, everyone in the room understood the deeper problem. They did not know what they did not know. How many other improvements had humans made that were never written down, never officially recorded, just quietly implemented because they worked better? Transportation networks were failing in more visible ways. Captain Vex had given up running routes through the Kessler Belt entirely. The last convoy she escorted lost 2 ships to asteroid collisions, and insurance companies were refusing to cover high-risk routes at any price. Trade routes that had been profitable for centuries were now abandoned, forcing cargo to take longer paths that added weeks to delivery times. The economic impact rippled outward. Frontier colonies that depended on regular supply runs began experiencing shortages of basic goods. Food prices increased as agricultural products sat in warehouses waiting for transport. Manufacturing slowed as components failed to arrive on schedule. The galactic economy did not collapse, but it contracted, shrinking for the first time in recorded history. Regional Trade Administrator Korth reviewed shipping manifests with despair. Before the exile, human pilots had handled roughly 30% of high-risk routes despite representing only 8% of licensed pilots. They had taken the dangerous jobs, the routes through unstable regions that offered higher pay, but required faster reflexes and better judgment. Other species could fly these routes technically, but humans seemed to thrive on the challenge in ways others did not. Now those routes were simply not being flown. Cargo companies offered premium rates to attract pilots, but the jobs remained unfilled. The few non-human pilots who attempted them suffered accident rates 3 times higher than humans had experienced. Insurance costs skyrocketed, making the routes economically unviable even when pilots could be found. Entire sectors of space were becoming isolated, cut off from the economic networks that had sustained them. The Council Defense Fleet faced an embarrassment that was rapidly becoming a genuine security crisis. In the past year, pirate attacks had increased by 300%. Not because there were more pirates, but because the pirates had learned the fleet could not respond effectively. Hit-and-run attacks that would have been suicidal when humans patrolled the space lanes were now succeeding regularly. Commander Tresh had been promoted to Fleet Admiral, given expanded authority and resources to address the crisis. But resources were not the problem. The fleet had ships, weapons, and trained personnel in abundance. What it lacked was the aggressive, proactive approach that human crews had brought. Human captains had anticipated pirate movements, taken risks to intercept raiders before they struck, pushed their ships and crews to the edge of safety limits to protect civilian traffic. The current fleet was competent and professional, following tactical doctrine precisely. But doctrine was reactive, designed for known threats and conventional scenarios. Pirates were neither. They struck from unexpected angles, used unconventional tactics, and disappeared before conventional responses could be mobilized. The fleet needed improvisation and intuition, qualities that could not be taught through training manuals. Tresh authorized new patrol patterns, faster response protocols, and advanced tactical training. The measures helped marginally but did not solve the core problem. The fleet needed personnel who thought like humans, who were willing to bend rules and take chances in service of mission success. But such personnel were either not available or were trained out of those instincts by systems that valued compliance over initiative. Infrastructure failures accelerated on colony worlds throughout Council space. On Outpost 77, Governor Nethys declared a state of emergency after the main power grid collapsed during a routine maintenance cycle. The grid should not have failed during maintenance. Redundant systems should have kept power flowing. But the redundancies had been designed by human engineers who understood how systems actually failed in the real world rather than how they theoretically should fail. The replacement team had followed the maintenance schedule perfectly, shutting down components in the documented sequence. What they did not know was that Karen Morris had quietly upgraded several junction points to handle load transfers that the original design could not accommodate. Those upgrades were not in the official blueprints, added during construction, when Morris realized the original specifications were inadequate for local conditions. Without those undocumented improvements, the power grid had failed exactly as the original design predicted it would. It took 3 weeks to restore full power, 3 weeks when colonists huddled in emergency shelters and critical systems ran on batteries. When engineers finally figured out what had happened, they found similar undocumented improvements throughout the colony infrastructure. Morris and Sullivan had essentially rebuilt the entire settlement to be better than the plans specified, but they had never updated the plans. Outpost 77 was not unique. Reports came in from colonies across Council space describing similar discoveries. Humans had improved everything they touched, often without bothering to document the changes because to them the improvements were too obvious to need explanation. Now those colonies faced a choice. Spend years mapping all the undocumented changes or risk catastrophic failures when maintenance crews made changes based on obsolete blueprints. Scientific progress had not merely slowed but effectively stopped in many fields. Dr. Kellen Frost published a paper analyzing research output across council institutions over the past 7 years. The numbers were devastating. Publications were down 40%. Patent applications had dropped by half. Breakthrough discoveries that opened new fields of study had virtually disappeared. The decline was not because scientists had become less intelligent or less educated. If anything, funding had increased and facilities had improved. The problem was cultural. Council science had always been methodical, careful, and consensus-driven. Researchers proposed hypotheses that were likely to succeed, conducted experiments that were likely to produce publishable results, and avoided risks that might waste resources. Human scientists had been different. They pursued wild ideas that probably would not work. They took intellectual risks that seemed reckless. They challenged established theories and questioned accepted wisdom. Most of their crazy ideas failed, but the few that succeeded opened entirely new fields of investigation. More importantly, their willingness to take risks had pushed other scientists to be bolder, creating a culture where innovation was celebrated rather than viewed with suspicion. Without humans, council science had reverted to its cautious nature. Researchers worked on incremental improvements to established knowledge, avoiding anything too radical or controversial. Papers were published, careers advanced, and laboratories hummed with activity. But genuine breakthroughs, the kind that redefined understanding and created new technologies, had become vanishingly rare. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions to address what was now called the efficiency crisis. Committees were expanded, studies were fast-tracked, and massive funding was allocated to solve the problems. 15 years had passed since the exile, and the Galactic Council faced a reality they had never imagined possible. Their civilization was not collapsing dramatically but eroding steadily, losing ground in every metric that mattered. Economic growth had stalled. Scientific advancement had slowed to a crawl. Infrastructure required constant emergency repairs. The systems that had sustained galactic society for millennia were failing in ways both obvious and subtle. The emergency session convened with unprecedented secrecy. Council Speaker Venth addressed representatives from only the 7 most powerful species, excluding junior members who might complicate delicate discussions. The topic was unthinkable just 5 years earlier. They were going to discuss asking humanity to return. The debate lasted for 3 days. Pride warred with pragmatism. Ideology clashed with economic reality. Some argued that the problems were temporary, that given enough time and resources, the council would adapt and recover. Others pointed to the data showing 15 years of steady decline with no indication of reversal. Eventually, practical necessity won over wounded pride. Ambassador Krelthos of the Vaxian Confederacy was chosen to lead the diplomatic mission. He was young by council standards, only 400 years old, and had been among the minority who voted against exile. His ship, the Concordance, departed council space with minimal fanfare, crossing the border into the uncharted regions where humanity had been forced to settle. The crew carried official apologies, formal petitions for humanity's return, and offers of concessions that would have been unthinkable during the exile vote. What they found in the outer territories left them speechless. The first human settlement they encountered was New Boston, built on a planet the council survey teams had dismissed as uninhabitable. The world's gravity was twice Earth standard, atmospheric pressure was crushing by most species standards, and the native ecosystem was aggressively hostile. The survey report had concluded that only the most desperate would attempt colonization, and even then, failure was virtually guaranteed. New Boston sprawled across 3 continents with a population exceeding 2 million. Massive towers stretched toward purple skies, their architecture designed to handle the intense gravity through engineering solutions the council had never seen. Humans moved through the city wearing exoskeletons that augmented their strength, but they moved with ease and confidence, clearly comfortable in an environment that should have been impossible. Governor Paul Martinez greeted the delegation with polite formality. He was in his 50s, meaning he had been a young adult when the exile occurred. He remembered council space but felt no nostalgia for it. As he guided Ambassador Krelthos through the city, Martinez explained how New Boston had been established in just 12 years, transforming a death world into a thriving colony through determination and innovation. The Concordance's crew documented everything with growing amazement. Fusion plants that converted atmospheric gases into unlimited power, agricultural domes that produced food yields 3 times what council colonies achieved, manufacturing facilities that operated with efficiency levels thought to be theoretically impossible. Everywhere they looked, humans had turned obstacles into opportunities. But New Boston was just the beginning. Martinez informed them that humanity now controlled 42 colonies across worlds the council had surveyed and abandoned. Each colony had been built on a planet deemed too difficult, too dangerous, or too expensive to settle. Each one thrived through solutions that combined human ingenuity with a willingness to attempt what seemed impossible. The delegation traveled to Deepwater, an ocean world where storms raged with such violence that the council had classified it as a severe hazard to navigation. Humanity had built floating cities that harvested energy from those very storms, turning destructive weather into unlimited power. Administrator Helen Carter showed them underwater farms that grew food in the mineral-rich depths, aquaculture facilities that produced protein for millions, and shipyards that constructed vessels unlike anything in council space. The ships built at Deepwater incorporated design principles that council engineers insisted violated fundamental physics. They were faster, more efficient, and required less maintenance than comparable council vessels. When asked how they achieved such results, the human engineers simply shrugged and explained they had experimented until they found what worked. The systematic testing, the willingness to try unconventional approaches, and the acceptance of failure as part of learning had produced technological leaps that centuries of council research had never achieved. Carter explained that Deepwater was entirely self-sufficient, producing everything it needed and exporting advanced technology to other human colonies. The colony had been established with refugees who had nothing but determination and each other. 15 years later, they were wealthier and more technologically advanced than many council core worlds. At every colony, the delegation found the same pattern. Humans had not merely survived in exile, they had excelled in ways that made their former achievements in council space seem modest by comparison. Without bureaucratic committees slowing every decision, without regulations designed for the lowest common denominator, and without the cultural expectation to maintain comfortable mediocrity, humanity had accelerated. The scientific research station at Haven provided perhaps the most shocking revelations. Dr. Chris Bennett, who had left his work at Station Kepler unfinished, now led a research coalition that had made breakthrough discoveries the Council's top scientists had declared impossible. Advances in quantum physics, faster-than-light communication, gravity manipulation, and artificial intelligence had all emerged from human laboratories in just 15 years. Bennett gave the delegation a tour of facilities that made Council research stations look primitive by comparison. When asked how they had progressed so quickly, Bennett's explanation was simple but damning. Without committees to approve every experiment, without review boards that discouraged risky research, and without the need to build consensus among 47 species with different priorities, human scientists could pursue ideas the moment inspiration struck. More importantly, human research culture celebrated failure as much as success. Scientists who took big risks and failed were praised for trying rather than punished for wasting resources. That cultural acceptance of failure meant researchers were willing to attempt experiments that had a 90% chance of failure, but a 10% chance of revolutionary breakthrough. Council science, which only approved projects with high probability of success, never attempted those experiments and thus never made those breakthroughs. The diplomatic mission spent 3 months touring human colonies and documenting what humanity had achieved. Every report sent back to Council headquarters reinforced the same uncomfortable truth. Humanity had not needed the Council. They had never needed it. What the Council needed desperately was humanity. Ambassador Krelthos finally arranged a formal meeting with the Human Leadership Council. He had prepared elaborate presentations about the benefits of rejoining Council space, negotiated concessions that granted humanity unprecedented privileges, and rehearsed arguments designed to appeal to human ambitions and interests. None of it mattered. Governor Martinez, speaking for the unified human colonies, delivered their response with quiet finality. Humanity respectfully declined the invitation to return to Council space. The exile had been painful, forcing families to abandon homes they had built over generations, but it had also been liberating, freeing humanity from constraints they had not realized were holding them back. In Council space, humans had always been the junior species, the newcomers who had to prove themselves worthy of respect. Every initiative required approval from beings who viewed 300 years as a brief moment. Every innovation had to be justified to committees that saw no reason to change systems that had worked adequately for millennia. Humans had achieved much despite those constraints, but they had always been operating with one hand tied behind their backs. In exile, those constraints were gone. Humans answered only to themselves, built societies that valued their particular strengths and created systems that rewarded rather than discouraged their natural inclinations. Why would they voluntarily return to being second-class citizens in someone else's civilization when they could continue building their own? Martinez acknowledged that individual humans might choose to return to Council space if permitted, and humanity would not prevent that choice. But as a civilization, as a unified political entity, humanity's answer was final. They had moved on. The galaxy that exiled them no longer held appeal. Ambassador Krelthos returned to Council space with documentation of humanity's achievements and the formal rejection of the Council's offer. His report sparked furious debate. Some argued for increasing the concessions, offering humanity equal status rather than junior membership. Others suggested that humanity's success proved exile had been the right choice, allowing them to flourish in their own territory. But a few, a small minority willing to face uncomfortable truths, recognized the real lesson. The Council had not exiled a disruptive element. They had exiled their own potential for greatness, choosing comfortable stagnation. 25 years had passed since the exile vote, and the divergence between humanity and the Galactic Council had become so profound that they might as well have been separate universes. The Council chambers, once filled with confident debates about galactic policy, now hosted increasingly desperate discussions about survival and relevance. Economic data painted a stark picture. The Council's combined economic output had decreased by 18% over the past decade. Not a catastrophic collapse, but a steady erosion that showed no signs of reversing. Trade volumes were down, manufacturing efficiency continued to decline, and innovation in commercial sectors had effectively stopped. The economy was not dying, but it was not growing either. It simply existed, maintaining itself through momentum rather than vitality. Council economists produced detailed reports analyzing the stagnation. They identified specific sectors experiencing problems, quantified efficiency losses, and proposed interventions designed to stimulate growth. But their recommendations all shared a fundamental flaw. They addressed symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. The Council had built a civilization optimized for stability, and stability was incompatible with growth. Scientific output told an even more concerning story. Dr. Kellen Vross, now serving as the Council's chief scientific advisor, presented annual research summaries that showed minimal progress across all fields. Laboratories continued operating, papers continued being published, and scientists continued their work. But breakthrough discoveries, the kind that opened entirely new fields of study, had become extraordinarily rare. The few major advances that did occur almost always originated from human research that the Council eventually learned about and attempted to replicate. Human scientists published their findings freely, sharing discoveries with anyone interested. Council researchers studied those publications, confirmed the results, and slowly implemented the new knowledge. The Council had become dependent on human innovation, while contributing almost nothing in return. Vross understood the root cause even if others refused to acknowledge it. Council science was built on consensus and caution. Research proposals went through multiple review committees before receiving funding. Experimental protocols required approval from safety boards, ethics panels, and resource allocation groups. By the time a project actually began, it had been examined from every angle and deemed unlikely to fail. That same process eliminated any project that might produce spectacular success, because spectacular success required accepting high risk of failure. Human researchers pursued risky ideas knowing most would fail. They celebrated the failures as learning experiences and used them to refine their next attempts. Council researchers avoided risky ideas entirely because failure could damage careers and waste limited resources. The result was predictable. Council science produced safe, incremental progress while human science made revolutionary leaps. Infrastructure problems had escalated from concerning to critical. Station Theta 9, where this story began 25 years earlier, had been abandoned entirely after a cascade failure in the life support system killed 37 residents. Investigation revealed that maintenance crews had made seemingly minor modifications based on outdated blueprints, not realizing that Danny Fisher had substantially improved the original, designed in ways that were never documented. Similar disasters occurred with decreasing frequency, only because colonies had learned to be extremely conservative about infrastructure changes. Nothing was modified, nothing was upgraded, and nothing was improved. Systems were maintained exactly as they existed, even when everyone knew they were operating below optimal efficiency. The choice was between accepting mediocre performance or risking catastrophic failure, and colonies chose mediocrity every time. The Council Defense Fleet had effectively ceded control of outer system territories to pirates and independent militias. Fleet Admiral Tresh, now nearing retirement, reviewed tactical reports that showed Council influence shrinking year by year. The fleet still controlled core systems and major trade routes, but frontier regions were increasingly autonomous, governed by local security forces that the Council could neither support nor control. Pirate attacks had actually decreased in recent years, not because the fleet had become more effective, but because there was less worth stealing. Trade volumes were down, fewer ships traveled through dangerous regions, and the overall economic activity that attracted pirates had diminished. The fleet's apparent success in reducing piracy was actually evidence of economic decline. Tresh had spent 2 decades attempting to reform fleet culture, trying to instill the aggressive, proactive approach that human crews had demonstrated. Every initiative failed. Training programs produced graduates who could follow doctrine perfectly, but could not think creatively under pressure. Promotional systems rewarded reliability and compliance rather than initiative and results. The entire institutional structure was designed to prevent the kind of behavior Tresh was trying to encourage. Meanwhile, humanity continued to expand and thrive. New colonies were established on worlds that pushed the boundaries of what species could tolerate. The human population had tripled to 36 million across 68 colonies. Their economy was growing at rates that would have seemed impossible to Council economists. Their technology advanced so rapidly that Council intelligence struggled to keep assessments current. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the exploration vessel Pathfinder, pushing deeper into unknown space than any human ship had traveled before. His crew had discovered 6 habitable worlds in the past year, adding to the dozens of potential colony sites already identified. Each discovery was shared freely with humanity's allies, a growing coalition of minor species that the Council had historically ignored or exploited. These minor species, grateful for human assistance and inspired by human achievement, had begun forming their own alliance outside Council authority. The Coalition of Independent Worlds, as they called themselves, adopted many human approaches to governance and development. They encouraged innovation rather than fearing it, rewarded success rather than punishing failure, and built systems designed for growth rather than stability. The coalition remained friendly toward the Council, maintaining trade relationships and diplomatic contacts, but they were not subordinate, not seeking Council approval for their decisions. They represented an alternative model of galactic civilization, one that increasingly appealed to colonies on the Council's periphery, who saw their own world stagnating while coalition worlds flourished. On Earth's new capital world of Haven, President Nicole Brooks addressed the Human Congress on the 25th anniversary of exile. She spoke of challenges overcome, achievements earned, and futures bright with possibility. But she also addressed the question that everyone knew was coming. The Council had sent yet another delegation, this time offering full reinstatement with complete autonomy over human internal affairs and equal voting power with the founding species. Brooks acknowledged the generosity of the offer and thanked the Council for their recognition of humanity's value. Then she delivered the answer that had been decided weeks earlier through democratic vote across all human colonies. Humanity declined, not with anger or bitterness, but simply because returning to Council space no longer made sense for human interests and aspirations. The younger generation of humans, Those born after the exile barely understood why the question kept being asked. They had grown up in a civilization that valued their contributions, that rewarded their innovations, and that never told them to slow down or fit in. Council space represented nothing they wanted. It was the past, a place their parents and grandparents had been forced to leave. They were building the future, and the future was not compatible with the Council's vision of eternal stability. Brooks explained that individual humans remained free to emigrate to Council space if they wished, and a few dozen did so each year, but humanity as a civilization, as a unified political and cultural entity, had moved beyond needing or wanting what the Council offered. The rejection was not hostile but final. The Galactic Council received this response with resignation rather than surprise. 25 years of decline had taught them that problems could not be solved by committee, when the problems were the committees themselves. A few voices called for forcing humanity's return through economic pressure or military threat, but these suggestions were quickly dismissed. Humanity was no longer the vulnerable refugee population that had departed 25 years earlier. Human technology had advanced to the point where the Council could not be certain of military superiority. The coalition of independent worlds would likely support humanity in any conflict. Most critically, the Council had learned that you cannot force people to be innovative, to care deeply about excellence, to push boundaries that others considered fixed. Those qualities had to be genuine, emerging from culture and values rather than external pressure. Council Speaker Venth, serving his final term before mandatory retirement, commissioned one last study on the human question. He asked for complete honesty, no diplomatic language or political considerations. The study took 2 years to complete, and its findings were devastating in their clarity.